Welcome, everyone. Welcome today. Thanks for joining me on this Thursday afternoon here, at least where I am in New York. Thanks for joining me for this Canson Infinity webinar. It's great to see quite a few folks here joining us tonight. Yep, great to see everyone joining. As usual, please, if you want to say hello or anything like that, you can do that in the chat. There's also a Q&A section where I suggest or advise that you leave your questions there. If you put them in the chat, I'll see them as well, but the Q&A is dedicated for that. So I'll be looking at that first before I look at the chat, but feel free to use the chat to post any comments or things like that. All right, so let's get started. My name is Robert Rodriguez Jr. I'm a professional landscape photographer, a printmaker. I've been making my own prints since I started photography over 15 years ago, close to 20 probably. I'm a teacher, workshop instructor, and I'm honored to be giving you this presentation today on Canson Infinity papers. I've been a Canson Infinity ambassador since 2011, so quite a while, and I've been using Canson papers since that time. And I absolutely love them. Even if I wasn't an ambassador, I would definitely continue to use Canson papers. I think they're the best papers on the market. We'll get into more of that later on. If you've been attending these sessions this year, this series that I've been giving every couple of months, we've had webinars on the printing workflow in general. We've done color management. We've done an in-depth webinar on matte papers. And today we're going to finish the year looking at Canson's non-matte papers, what are classified as gloss or luster papers or darkroom papers, as well as their RC papers as well. Now, I'm a landscape photographer and a nature photographer, so that means that I'll be using my images, of course, to demonstrate the ideas here and show you prints. But I try to make these concepts as universal as possible. So that means that regardless of what genre or subject you photograph, I hope that this will be applicable to you as well. So don't get too caught up in exactly the kinds of things I'm showing. You can apply this to portraits or urbanscapes, cityscapes, abstracts, etc. What's most important is that you take these concepts and you apply them, again, for your own creative process, for your own creative vision. And this lets you decide what works best for you. All right, so as I said before, please use the Q&A to post your questions. I will look at it occasionally, but there will definitely be a dedicated time at the end, 5 or 10 minutes where I'll answer questions, etc. All right, so with that said, I think I'm going to jump in. So before I talk about all of the non-matte papers, I just want to share an approach that I use and that I teach in terms of selecting papers. The reason why I think this approach is powerful is because it allows you to make printing a part of the creative process. So you can really start to think about telling stories with your prints. I've shared this many times before, but in case anyone is here for the first time or just as a refresher, I'll briefly cover it again. You can think about two general ways of choosing or selecting a paper. The first one I call the paper first approach. This is the one that most of us, if not all of us, start with. We look at different papers and we sort of decide or choose a paper that we think is going to work best for our images. We're looking at the paper and again, we select that paper and then we print all of our work on that paper. Now, I prefer what I call the image first approach, which is slightly different. Instead of starting with the paper, you start with your image. You start with the thing that you want to print, that you want to bring into the physical world. And then you think about what paper would be best for that image, whether it's black and white, whether it's landscape. You have this creative choice. You evaluate each image based on what you're trying to say, what you're trying to convey, and then you choose a paper that best complements that. And I think this approach, the reason this approach I think is so powerful is because it allows you, again, it allows your prints to evolve over time as you improve and grow as an artist. As your work changes, You can use Canson's range of papers to match your artistic intent. And that just gives you more flexibility and really allows you to leverage these amazing papers in a more creative way. Each of Canson's papers has its own sort of personality. So even though they all do an excellent job of preserving the color and the detail in your images, each one provides a slightly different interpretation, if you will, or as Ansel Adams would say, a different performance. Some are subtle, some are soft, some are more dramatic, more aggressive, more or less contrast, etc., etc. And this is really the art that, as you learn and as your skills improve, you can, again, use this to create much more nuanced and much more unique prints of your images. Now, you can divide papers, all papers from any manufacturer, into two broad categories. And this is going to be about the biggest aesthetic difference, which is Dmax. Dmax is a measure of how much black a paper can hold. Black density is another way that we say this in the industry. And it's important because this defines the total contrast that a paper can reproduce. So the higher the density, the higher this measurement of Dmax, the more contrast the printed image will exhibit, and the more contrast it'll have, and it'll just look different from a paper that has less Dmax. Now, this isn't just a technical number. As I said, this is important because it affects the overall contrast. It changes the way that an image looks and feels, the way it looks and feels on paper, and this greatly influences the way others perceive your print or potentially perceive your print. And again, it also influences your creative vision. So you want to choose a paper that will complement this overall creative vision. So we see here on this chart, these are all of Canson's papers. On the left, you see the matte papers into different categories, depending on the mill, etc., how they're manufactured. And then on the right here, the papers we're going to be talking about today are the gloss luster papers, again, into two broad categories, the fine art darkroom papers and then the RC papers. So we're going to be focusing on this right side here. And all of these papers, without exception, all of them have greater Dmax than the matte papers. Unlike matte papers, where the Dmax can vary a little bit depending on the paper, some matte papers have more, some matte papers have less Dmax, the Dmax level of all of these papers, regardless of whether they're darkroom or RC, they're all very close. They're all higher than matte papers. So you're not going to see much difference in between all of these papers in terms of the Dmax, but they're all going to be, again, higher than your matte papers from Canson. So in this gloss luster category, as I said, the main aesthetic difference, and again, I'm comparing this to your matte papers, is, as I said, higher Dmax. They all going to have a very smooth surface. You're not going to have that variation of textures that you have with matte papers. So all these papers are going to be pretty much very close in terms of texture, which is to say, very smooth. And all of these papers will give you a more, from an aesthetic standpoint, a more photographic looking print. Because of the Dmax, they're going to be sort of louder, more aggressive, a more aggressive feel, more photographic, more literal, more traditional in terms of that dark room look. Now, there are two subcategories in the gloss luster papers. There are the darkroom papers on the left, and as I said, the RC papers on the right, which are more like your standard photo lab paper. So let's look at these two categories individually. Now, the reason why they call them darkroom papers, as I said, they emulate. These papers the goal is to emulate darkroom prints from the past. They're going to have a very beautiful look and feel, a fine art aesthetic. Again, they emulate that feel of traditional darkroom prints. Also, they are fully archival, museum grade. What do I mean by that? That means that they don't use any OBAs, or at least OBAs that are added to the paper to increase the whiteness. OBA stands for optical brightening agent. And optical brightening agent is a chemical that a lot of manufacturers add to their papers to make them look whiter. And if they look whiter, then you have a little more contrast, a little more dynamic range. Problem with the OBA is that it fades over time. And this fading makes the paper non-archival, because if it fades in 10 or 15 years, it's going to change the way the image looks, and that's not considered archival or museum grade quality. So these darkroom papers, the Platine, Baryta Photographique, and Baryta Prestige, they all don't have any OBAs added for the purpose of increasing the whiteness. They do have a Baryta layer. This is a barium sulfate chemical that does have some OBAs in it, but that's just the nature in this Baryta layer, which gives the paper its quality and its finish. And this trace amount of OBA that's in the this coating, the barium sulfate coating, has very little effect on the archivalness. Maybe it reduces it by 2 or 3%, but not like a regular paper where the OBAs are added in drastic measures to increase the whiteness. Now, in terms of the differences between the three papers, and I see someone asking about difference between Baryta Photographique and Baryta Prestige. Well, the difference between the three has to do with the finish and also has to do with the paper base. So you see here that Platine Fiber Rag has a 100% cotton paper base. And these, when you feel this paper in your hand and you feel the back of it, it's 100% cotton with an inkjet coating in it. So that gives it a very beautiful feel, particularly good if you're doing, portfolios or you're handling the prints. And this paper is unique because of the cotton backing. Baryta Photographique 2 is, and by the way, before I move on, Platine, which I'll show you in a minute, Platine also has a very extremely subtle sort of surface dimension that makes it not 100% smooth. So there's a little bit of a dimension on the surface, which again gives it a really beautiful look. And I'll show you an example of this. Now, Baryta Photographique and Baryta Prestige do not have a cotton backing. It's a mix of cotton and alpha cellulose. So they're going to have more of a, less of a cotton feel, more of your traditional darkroom print with the cellulose backing. And Baryta Photographique 2 is smoother, the smoothest of these three papers. And it's going to be maybe the less shiniest of the three. So more of a satin finish compared to Platine. And then when we move to Prestige, Prestige is going to be the shiniest of the three papers, a little bit more gloss. I wouldn't call it a gloss paper, but it's a little bit shinier. It's a little bit heavier. The Prestige comes in the 340 GSM, and it has a mix of cotton actually in the backing. So it makes it a paper that is shinier, and the color gamut, meaning that the number of colors that the paper can hold, is a tiny bit higher on Prestige than it is on the other two papers. Again, this is a measurement, right? And it depends on what you're printing and the image. You may not notice this increase in color whatsoever. They're all going to give you beautiful, wonderful saturation. It's just a question of the color gamut, and color gamut is just a measure of how many different colors the paper can hold. Prestige has the highest color gamut, but it's very, very small. I usually recommend, when people ask me about Prestige, I recommend if you've got images, for example, neon glowing lights or something that was extremely saturated or extremely rich in color, give the Prestige a try. It might give you more color than what you would get on the other two. But again, that depends on the image. And for most things, where it's portraits or landscapes or what have you, you're not going to notice a difference in terms of the color. It's going to be a difference in the shininess of the paper, how bright it is. Platine is going to be a little more fine art feeling because of the cotton backing. Baryta Photographique is going to be the most traditional paper in terms of the darkroom, really smooth surface, more of a satin look. And then the Baryta Prestige is going to be the most aggressive and the loudest of all because it's got a shinier surface. They all have amazing DMAX, all have amazing detail. So it's just very nuanced differences between the three papers. As far as all three darkroom papers, honestly, they really have the same amount of DMAX. When I print on all three, I don't notice a difference in the black level. They all will preserve shadow details extremely well. Black density on these three papers really isn't a factor. I would say of the three, the one that is going to give you the richest blacks and shadows perhaps is Baryta Photographique 2. But again, we're talking very, very small differences, and it all depends on the image. right? The images are going to affect the way it looks. You may not take advantage of the blacks, etc. But the Barita Photographique 2 has amazing DMAX. For a satin paper, prestige, a little bit shinier and a little more aggressive, more pop, if you will. And the platine, for me, has that beautiful, wonderful fine art feel because of the cotton backing. RC papers are different because the paper itself is encased, or the cotton, not the cotton, but the paper base is encased in a plastic, a resin. That's why they call it RC, resin coated. That's what the RC comes from. And so it makes the paper more durable, more water resistant. They have that sort of photo lab feel, but they don't have the same feel as one of the fine art darkroom papers. They don't feel as nice. They don't look as nice. And but they still provide great print quality. They're great for proofing. They have high OBAs. That's the other thing. So these papers are going to look whiter, but they have a lot of OBAs in them. And so archivalness is not the goal with these papers. They're more just your, as I said, your standard photo lab paper. They're great for proofing as long as you don't need lots of longevity with them. The difference between the three papers really is the reflectivity of the surface. Satin is going to be the least reflective, and then photo luster a little bit shinier, and then photo gloss, which is Canson's only true gloss paper, is going to be gloss, like a mirror, right? So it's very, very shiny, in case that's the look that you're going for. I suggest that if you're starting to get into Canson papers and you don't want to spend the higher, because these papers are going to be a little bit less expensive, if you want to experiment before moving over to the museum grade papers, the darkroom papers, these papers are going to give you a nice feel for your color management, for your printing, as you improve your skills as a printer, and then you can transfer that over to the other papers when you're ready. And the color and the density is really, really close. So you're not going to, you're not comparing apples to oranges, right? You'll be very close in terms of getting the same sort of look and feel, but now with the more improved darkroom papers. I would say that photo satin is the closest to a traditional darkroom paper. It's the flattest and flattest in terms of the shininess of the paper. Very smooth and very subdued. Photogloss, of course. And I'll show you examples of these. Photogloss is going to be the shiniest. So here's my attempt, my very best attempt to show you the surface of these papers so you can see what the surface looks like. Again, I'm trying to zoom in and really bring out the texture. So this is Barita Photographique, and you can see that it's really, really smooth. Again, I'm zooming in, and it's easier to see this when I compare with another paper. So this is Barita Photographique, right? Barita Photographique 2. Here is Platine, and you can see that Platine has a little bit more surface dimension. The surface isn't quite as smooth. You can see there that it has more stuff going on the surface, and that gives, for me, that gives the print a little bit more dimension if you want, if you want that, if you don't want perfectly smooth. So I'm going to go back up. I'm going to back up and go back to Barita Photographique. You see it's smoother, and then Platine a little bit more. Now, I wouldn't call this a texture at all. It's still very smooth, but there's some irregularity in the surface that the Barita Photographique doesn't have. Now, when we move to the Prestige, you can see how much shinier the Prestige is. So this is all photographed with the same light. I'm putting the same light on the paper in the same place, and you can see you get more reflection. This is the Prestige. It's shinier, not gloss, because it still is diffracting the light. You can see that the surface has some irregularity there, but this is Prestige, so shinier. Back to Platine, a lot more satin, if you will. That's Prestige. And then this is one of the RC papers. This is Photo Satin. And you can see Photo Satin is probably closest to the first one I showed you, which is Barita Photographique 2. Very satin, very similar. Again, this paper is an RC paper, so not as thick, doesn't feel as nice. It's got the OBAs, but very close in terms of the in terms of the surface itself. And really the best way to see this is to hold the papers in your hand. If you get a sample pack, then you can really see it for yourself. But hopefully here this gives you an idea of at least the surface and the reflectivity. None of these papers, of course, are going to have any kind of the texture that a textured matte paper would have. Now here's a chart that shows you all of Canson's papers, and the x-axis here on the bottom moves from the smoothest paper to the most textured paper on the right, and then on the left-hand side, we move from warmer papers. By warm, I mean that the paper has no OBA, so it's going to be a natural white, to papers that have OBAs. And as we move up the scale, the papers that have more OBAs, see the RC papers here at the top, are going to be the whitest. And generally speaking, the whiter it is, the sort of the cooler it looks. Warm doesn't mean that the paper is toned in any way. It just means that without the OBAs, it's going to be a more natural looking white. And if you were to look at any of these papers by themselves, without comparing them to the RC papers, they look perfectly white. There's no warm tone in them at all. It's only when you compare the RC to the non-RC that you actually see the difference in what the OBA is doing. But the interesting thing I want to show you here is that if we look at the papers with the orange icon here, not the white icon, but the orange icon, these are the glossy luster papers that we've been talking about. And you can see the RC papers way up here in terms of the whiteness level. And then the other three papers, Brighter Prestige, the whitest of the Darkroom papers, Brighter Photographique, and then Platine Fiber Rag down here. And I've just moved it in a little bit to the right here just to indicate that it has not really texture, but it has a little bit of surface texture. The same as the Rag Photographique, maybe even more interesting just because it's shinier and so you can actually see a little bit more. But I wouldn't call it texture. I'm just trying to use words to symbolize what you see with your eyes. Okay, and so these are but in general, none of the darkroom papers have any texture whatsoever. You'd have to go to these papers here to get any meaningful texture. This is moderate texture, and heavy texture is over here. All right, so all of the gloss luster papers pretty much smooth for all practical purposes in terms of looking at all of Canson's papers combined. All right, so I'm going to move over to my viewing station and show you some prints. First, I want to show you examples of prints that I've made on gloss luster papers and why I chose those images, or chose that paper for those images. And then I'll show you some comparisons between different papers so you can see side by side the same image. Just going to move over. Okay. This first image here is printed on Platine Fiber Rag, and this is why did I print this on Platine? Well, I chose a high Dmax paper. Again, the difference here is whether we want more or less Dmax. That's the biggest consideration. That's the first thing I think about when I'm choosing a paper. Do I think I want a softer, more suggestive, more painterly, more non-photographic look for an image and a print, or do I want something more photographic, more aggressive? I need more depth. I need shininess. I need all those things. I need something more photographic. And for this image, I chose Platine because I wanted this image to feel really grounded. I love the way the Platine makes the water on the rocks shine more. So anytime you have reflective surfaces that you really want to bring across, shininess, things like that, the Platine or a high Dmax paper is going to really bring that out. And I also like the way it really just brings these rocks forward. It gives you a lot of depth, a lot of dimension because of the darks and the blacks here. And this image isn't necessarily a sort of a soft, suggestive image. You know, I wanted it to feel more aggressive. The ocean is moving in. These rocks, these boulders are heavy. They're making really loud sounds as the surf moves them around. So that's why I chose Platine for this image, to really separate the contrast, the dynamic range between the shadows and these wonderful highlights up here. Platine, generally speaking, as I said before, because I love the cotton backing and I just like the surface. You can see here that maybe in here, you can see a little bit of what I'm talking about. It's just a tiny amount of surface irregularity that gives the print more dimension. Here is, again, similar theme here, right? Number one, I've got this reflective surface. This is a reflection in water of a building somewhere. Beautiful, rich colors. You can see those come out, no problem. This is on Baryta. Oops, sorry. This is on Baryta Photographique. This is probably on the original Baryta Photographique, not the 2. The 2 is essentially the same paper. It just has a better coating, which means that Canson is pushing again the Dmax to give you a little bit more contrast. But why did I choose a high Dmax paper for this image? As I said before, I love the dynamic range here. I wanted to really make it aggressive, very photographic looking. The shininess of the paper and the density of the paper, density in terms of the blacks, really makes the highlights really pop. It looks like you can actually touch the water, and that was the idea, just to give it as much pop as I possibly could, and a high Dmax paper works. I chose Baryta because Baryta has this very smooth satin finish. Unlike the Platine that I just showed you, this is, again, just a little bit smoother. And it just gives, it allows the textures in the image to breathe as much as possible, right? There's texture up here, very, very smooth down here, and that just allows the dynamic range and the variation in texture to remain intact versus anything in the paper giving some kind of texture to the image itself. Here's another image. You can put this one up here like so. And while a lot of people think of black and white as being naturally adapted to a high Dmax paper, that's not necessarily the case at all. I print a lot of images on, a lot of black and white images on matte papers because, again, it just depends on the image itself. I'm going for a particular look. I want something softer, more ephemeral. I want something where the blacks aren't really the dominant thing in the image. But in this image, I definitely wanted as much separation in the shadows as possible to separate all these shapes up here, the trees. Once again, we've got reflective surfaces. I tend to like that with a high Dmax paper. And these subtle tones, these gradations in the tones, you're just going to get a little bit more of that with a high Dmax paper. Why? Because you've got more black. Because you have more black, you have more shades of gray in the shadows, and that allows you to get more separation. This is also on Baryta Photographique, probably because I just love the smoothness of it for this image. You can see there very little, if any, I mean, very, very smooth paper. And I could have printed this on Platine. The Baryta is just a little bit more satin looking, and because I've got so many different textures in this picture, very, very smooth in the sky, then water, and then trees, etc. The Baryta just works beautifully for this. And again, it maintains that very photographic look, nice separation in all these areas here because of the black density. Now, I'm going to show you some examples of images printed on both high Dmax and on a matte paper. So here's the first one. And the one on the left is platine. The one on the right, I believe, is rag photographique. And the reason why I know is because I feel the surface. It feels very, very smooth. And there's only one or two matte papers that are that smooth. I'm pretty sure this is rag photographique. On the left is platine fiber rag. But you can see here very easily that the matte finish, while it's softer, more suggestive, more painterly, if you will, the platine version on the left is a little darker in terms of the shadows. Once again, reflections on the water. It really makes the water look and feel like it's actual water more than over here. And I just like that it has more depth. It feels like it has more depth, particularly the foreground here with these rocks, with the blacks. As I mentioned before, they give you more presence that allows the image to sort of extend more into the distance. It sort of increases the sense of depth, foreground, midground, background. And so I prefer this image on the platine on the left versus the rag matte on the right. Here's another example, platine on the left and rag photographique on the right. And once again, the matte paper on the right looks great. I love the way it has a nice soft feel to it. The shadows are okay. They're not as separated as they're over here. And I love the softness of the sky in the background. The problem, or shouldn't say problem, but the story of the image is the light. That's the thing that I want to convey in the picture. I want to generate as much energy from the light as possible, because that's the reason why I made the picture, that morning light coming over the horizon and throwing this light across these grasses, a little bit over here, rim lighting these rocks. And you can see easily that on the left-hand image, the platine version, because it has more Dmax, deeper blacks means you're going to get more pronounced highlights because you have more dynamic range. And so the energy of the light, the strength of the light is much better on the left-hand side. And that's really what I'm going for. So even though when I first printed this image, I perhaps printed it on the matte paper first, thinking that I wanted it to be soft and quiet because it was a very quiet scene, but the presence of the light on platine is really what I want to capture, what I wanted to express. And as soon as I saw it in this version, I said, yeah, that looks great, but it's missing something. It's missing the power of the light, early morning, the rim light, etc. And so that's why on this image, again, I chose a high Dmax paper. Here's another example. Once again, platine on the left. Yes, I like platine. Rag Photographique 2 on the right. I printed this one out yesterday just to use Rag Photo 2. And the reason why I use the Rag Photographique 2 as a comparison, even though I still prefer the platine version, but just to show you that Rag Photo 2, one of the improvements is, again, a little bit more density. And so the blacks here, really good. I mean, for a matte paper, very, very, very good. Can't really complain about the amount of black we're getting on a matte paper, but the idea here is to generate this movement from the foreground into the background to the light, to use these repetitive patterns as a way to drive the eye into the image, to create interest and drama. And again, you can see in the high Dmax version on the left, the darks move this down a little bit so you don't see that reflection. There we go. The darks here, they're not lost. There's information in there, but the information isn't the point of the picture. Is to really generate this gradation, separation between the deepest darks and the lightest lights. And over here, it just isn't as much. If I were to show this image or this print by itself, let's say I showed someone this print over here, it would look fine. But when I make this comparison, or when you make a comparison, then you can actually decide which paper is giving you the vision that you want for the image. And that's the one that you show the world. You don't go out and say, hey, which one do you like better? I mean, you can do that when you're learning with people you trust. But at the end of the day, someone's going to look at your print and they're either going to decide that it really resonates with them or it doesn't. And that's our job as artists to sort of make sure that what we want the print to say, what we want the image to say or convey, we're using the paper that best accomplishes that. And so for me, again, this is great. This is a little bit better. Here's another example, another black and white image. This time we've got Baryta Photographique on the left, and we've got Rag Photographique 2 on the right. And once again, very similar to the last image. The darks here on the rag paper, great. Nice separation here in the shadows. The lights on top, really nice. I can't complain, except that just a little more energy to the light because of the darker blacks over here. Just richer in the shadows. More separation in the shadows than over here. You can see here there's more tonal variation, even though it's very subtle. But there's more tones in here versus over here. And because this image is about the light, it is about the lights creating these shapes and the interplay between the shapes and the building up of the alternating light, dark, till we get to the sky on top. For me, again, the Baryta Photographique, the higher DMAX paper captures that better for this particular image. I have many of my images, in fact, maybe 60–70% of my black and white images I print on matte papers if you followed my work in the past. So it's not that I'm favoring, that I'm suggesting that black and white is best on a non-matte paper. But in this case, it is. These large areas of darks, I want them to feel a little deeper, a little bit more grounded, and they feel like that, they look like that here than they do over here. Now I'll show you an example before I take this one away. Here is the same image on Photo Satin Premium RC. So this is the first time that I'm showing you an RC paper, and I'm sure you can instantly tell that all of a sudden this paper doesn't look white anymore, or doesn't look pure white. This paper looks really white. And that's because the RC paper has lots of OBAs that's going to make it look whiter. And now this actually looks somewhat warm, even though it's a natural white. As before, you never noticed that it wasn't white, but now you do when we're making this comparison. So that's where the premium, the RC papers, the OBAs I mentioned before, they're on that scale that I showed you in that chart. Towards the top, they're maybe a slightly cooler looking. This is more natural, and because it's more natural, relatively speaking, it's going to look a little bit warmer, but it's not because the paper has any warmth into it or anything like that. However, what I did want to mention was in terms of the density, the DMAX, you can see very, very similar in both papers, much more so than the matte paper. So even the matte paper, even the RC paper, much better than the matte paper. Very, very similar in terms of the RC compared to Baryta Photographique. So this is a good sort of learning paper. If, again, you don't want to, if you want to save a little bit of money at first before you get to the more expensive, nicer papers, because you're going to get the same density. You're just going to get a much more natural and more fine art feel and look on the Baryta paper once you move on to that. Let me show you one more. This is printed on, once again, platine. And I have here premium, let me show you premium photo satin, photo luster. So here's photo luster. And so you can see with a color image, colors are virtually identical in both. Again, the RC paper, because of the OBAs, just going to look a little bit whiter, but you can see the translation from one to the other. If I printed on this and I was happy with this in terms of the density, the Dmax, I was happy with the way the image looked because of the higher contrast, and then I wanted to go ahead and print onto something like platine, and you can see this surface here, very, very smooth. Pretty much nothing going on here. A very sort of static, stale surface. But the platine definitely has much more interesting on the surface. Right? And this is relative to each paper. So again, good paper to practice on. And you can see that using Canson's profiles, these are not custom profiles, I'm using Canson's profiles that you download from the website. I'm getting virtually identical results in terms of color, which makes moving between the papers very easy, and you don't have to worry about drastic changes between colors and so forth. And that saves you time and frustration and money as well. I want to put one more image up here, and then we'll come back. We'll come back to it in a moment because I want to talk a little bit about Lightroom and just some printing tips, and then we'll come back to this image. All right, so just looking at the questions. One question that we have here is, can I tweak an image to emulate one paper while printing on another because I prefer a certain texture? Well, it's very, very hard to tweak the image to emulate a paper. And the reason that's difficult is because you're sort of experimenting and guessing what, how to emulate that paper. And now you are adding a variable that you can't control. I would say that that's really, really difficult to do. I always suggest that your source of truth, the thing that's going to give you the best confidence, is the image printed on the actual paper that you want to use, because then you actually get to see it. Emulations and adjusting the image means that now you've got many different variations for the paper, and if something doesn't look quite right, now you have to be really experienced to know whether it's the paper, whether it's your adjustment. Again, from a standpoint of being as consistent as possible, I always say that consistency is the key to printing. The more consistent you make your workflow, the more consistent your results. And when you're not consistent, that leads to ink and paper waste, which we all know is something that you want to try to avoid. Okay, I'm going to move into Lightroom here very quickly. And just to show share some quick printing tips. So this is the image that I showed you before on the viewing station, but when I print onto a non-matte paper, it's pretty much the same workflow. I'm not really changing anything I'm not changing anything from the way I normally print onto a matte paper. Again, I follow the same workflow. Once I'm happy with my editing, in Lightroom, in the Develop module, I press S to go into Soft Proof, and then I press Y. And the purpose for this is to, generally speaking, get a sense of what it's going to look like, and also allow us to pick or select the proper rendering intent. And so in Lightroom here, I'm going to select the profile. Right now, the profile selected is for Rag Photographique, but actually this is printed on, it's printed on platine. So I select the profile here, and then you can toggle between the two rendering intents, perceptual or relative. And the rendering intent is basically the way that Lightroom is going to translate the colors from the original image to the paper itself, because no paper can hold the amount of colors that are in your image. And so there's some compression going on in terms of the colors. And that compression is done in two ways. One is called perceptual, one is called relative. I'm not going to get too technical about how they do it, but they just can change the way the colors are transferred. And so there's perceptual, there's relative, very little difference, if any. When I select relative, like now, I can barely tell. Maybe in the back a little bit, I see the darks getting slightly lighter, but very, very, very small difference. On this particular image, and with high density papers, you tend to see less of a difference than you do with matte papers. If in doubt, we generally recommend you use perceptual. So I'm going to use a perceptual rendering intent. That's when I get into the print module. That's when you would actually choose that in terms of the printing it. This allows you to see which one you actually want to use. So in the print module, down here in the print job area, you can see here that I have a choice of perceptual or relative. They're not selectable now because I don't have a profile selected. So I want to use the Canson profile for Platine. So I'm going to select that here. And then you see here now that we can actually choose the rendering intent. But over here, when I toggle back and forth, there's no change, right? So this is not soft proofing. This is just pick the one that you want to use. And because we had decided before that perceptual was the better one, then I'm selecting perceptual here. And then once again, in terms of print resolution, general idea here is that I want to send an image to my printer at the printer's native resolution. Every printer or every manufacturer has a native resolution. Canon is 300 ppi. Epson is 360 ppi. They're going to print at that resolution regardless of what you send them. And so I rather interpolate the image in Lightroom because that gives you potentially a better result. The interpolation in Lightroom is better than what's in the printer's firmware. And so because this image, well, at this size, this looks like 8.5 by 11. If I was going to print this on 8.5 by 11, even with some borders here. And actually, let's select the actual paper that I used that I'm going to show you in a moment. So I printed this on A3 Plus, which is 13 by 19. Something like that. And something like that. I think I left about 1.5 inches border all around on the print that is on the viewing station. At this size, 13 by 19 with 1 inch or 1.5 inches border all around, the native resolution is 346. And I'm using a Canon Pro 1100. Canon printers have a native resolution of 300. Our native resolution at this size for the image that we have, the megapixel size of the image, our native is 346. Because I don't want to throw away information, I don't want to lose information, instead of interpolating to 300 here, I'm going to interpolate to 600. And the reason for that is because if I interpolate to 300, we're throwing away information. I let Lightroom interpolate it up to 600 ppi. And when I send it to my Canon printer, it only has to divide in half to actually do the print. Because remember, it's going to interpolate it to 300 regardless. But we have a cleaner, if you will, interpolation doing it in Lightroom. I usually apply some print sharpening just to make up for the inherent quality of the paper versus what I'm seeing on screen, which is a beautifully detailed 4K monitor. And so I turn print sharpening on. Standard of the three is the one I like the best, just enough to make a difference, but not too much to make it too obvious. And media type, here you see the difference between the media types matte, that's all matte papers, and any non-matte paper, that includes RC, darkroom paper, satin luster. Lightroom is just calling it glossy. And this changes the amount of sharpening because a matte paper usually, it will add a little bit more sharpening for the matte paper versus the glossy paper. And then want to make sure that I have the print profile, and when I'm all set, then I click on print. One last thing, by the way, I should mention, I did leave an important step out, critical step here, which is you have to be sure that you always select the proper media type, because that tells the printer the type of ink to use in terms of whether it's going to use a photo black ink or the matte black ink. And also the media type determines how much black ink the paper will put out. One thing I should mention, this is critically important, is that the reason why Canson and other paper manufacturers don't publish Dmax levels for the papers is because Dmax is a function of both the paper and the printer. They both contribute to the amount of Dmax you get. So printer manufacturers will come out with new printers and they'll say improve blacks. That means that the printer is capable of putting out more black ink, but the paper also has to be matched to get that density as well. So selecting the right media type means that the printer will know what paper it's printing on, and it'll put out as much ink as the paper can accept. That you set in the print settings here. In the printer driver, I'm going to come down to printer options. This should be the same for Canon and Epson with some slight differences. Quality and media. And here, media type. Okay, this is what I'm talking about. The media type, two ways to get this. Well, one way to get this information, go to the Canson website, and for the paper, they'll tell you what media type to use, whether you're going to use one of, they'll tell you whether you should use one of Canon's pre-built media types as a close match. So for example, photo paper semi-gloss, I believe, is what you would use for Baryta. Or if your printer supports it, which the Pro 1100 does, Canson will also provide AM1X files. And AM1X files are files that you can actually use to load in the actual Canson paper into your printer driver. So you see here that instead of me using one of Canon's built-in papers and trying to match this or matching it with whatever Canson recommends, I can just simply come to custom and select Platine right here. And this means now that I've selected the Canson paper in the Canon driver. You can only do this with an AM1X file, and you can only do this on Canon printers because Epson won't allow you to do this. I don't have to tell you why. Okay, so there it is, and this makes making sure that you have the right media type much easier. All right, so there's the media type. Everything else here, print quality, this is just the DPI setting, so I always use highest to get the most out of my printer, and you're good to go. And when I print, that's the actual print on Platine fiber rag. Why Platine for this image? Once again, look at those beautiful darks underneath the light coming through the ice. I really wanted to make the ice feel heavy. I wanted the drama of the darks, the shadows to really make the light come through. And so a high density paper here works better for that. Matte paper, beautiful painterly look, but doesn't bring across the sort of the weight and the weight of both the ice themselves, but also the weight that the darks and the blacks add to this image, because it really propels or energizes the light. All right. So a lot of times I'm thinking about tonal variation, how much you want to project the highlights versus the shadows, and whether I want something that's more painterly or more photographic. And in this case, this is probably more of a photographic kind of image than a painterly one with soft light and fog or ephemeral light in the background. This is pretty literal, if you will. All right, so just a few suggestions here in terms of just some quick guidelines, right? If you say something like, I need quality black and white prints, gallery quality black and white prints, right? You're not going to use an RC paper. Baryta Prestige is probably going to give you that really shiny surface, really make your black and white prints pop. Platine fiber rag, you can't go wrong with that either. Again, these are general guidelines. A lot of my images I print, black and white images I print on matte papers, but just to give you some quick shortcuts here. Fine art reproductions, you're not going to use a high gloss paper, probably never. You're going to use a matte paper for that because you're looking for something that matches a painting, etc. Maximum archival quality, anything except RC papers, because the RC papers have the OBAs. That's going to limit your archivalness. You have, let's say you have vibrant color landscapes. This one is tough. I can't really suggest a matte or non-matte paper alone. So Baryta Photographique 2 is going to give you beautiful color and texture and depth for a landscape, but Rag Photographique 2 as well, even though we're not talking about matte papers today, but that's also going to be a great choice if you're, again, looking for that more suggestive painterly look. You don't want those dark, contrasty blacks. You don't want something so loud. Okay, so that's kind of how I think about it. You want painterly textured look. That's going to be a matte paper if you need texture, because you're not going to get any real texture on a darkroom paper. And if you need budget or proofing, again, that's the RC papers, as I've talked about before. All right, so I will look at a couple more questions here. Does that mean that I should always interpolate 2x the printer's native resolution as a general rule? Only when your native resolution is higher than your printer's native resolution. So when you're making a print, if the native resolution of the print is 300 or less, then you interpolate at 300 for your Canon. If it's 360 or less, you interpolate at 360 for the Epson. If your native resolution is above that, and the native resolution is basically determined by the size of the print, right? So the bigger you make your print, the lower your resolution is going to be, because that you have to spread the pixels on a bigger sheet of paper, unless you've got huge files, in which case it's not going to matter, right? So if your native resolution is higher than the printer's native resolution, again, 300 for Canon, 360 for Epson, then you would double the native resolution. You would go to 600 for Canon or 720 for Epson. Yes, so very quickly, if you want to find the AM1X files or the profiles, all of those are found on Canson's website. Just go to Canson's website and look for ICC profiles. You select your printer, you select your printer and the printer manufacturer and the printer model, sorry. And then you get a list of all of Canson's papers, and then you'll see there where you can download the profiles. And if your printer accepts or can use AM1X files, then you'll see the AM1X files there that you can download as well. If your printer does not or cannot use AM1X files, if it doesn't support that, Epson or one of Canon's printers that doesn't support it, then the chart there on Canson's website will tell you which of the printer's media types you should use, the built-in media type. And you write that down very carefully. I have a notebook where I wrote everything down so that I knew that I was using the right media type. One of the beautiful things about Lightroom is that once you make a print using a particular paper and it works and you've got all your settings right, you can just save that as a template in Lightroom, otherwise known as a preset. So this, in the future, you just call up that preset for that paper and it sets the media type and the profile for you automatically. Again, that avoids and eliminates a lot of frustration with misconfigured things. You don't have to worry that you miss something, because there's a lot of settings to make. What are the questions here? Separate session on custom ICC profiles. I don't have any plans for that at the moment, but maybe at some point we will talk about that. Making custom profiles, you either need expensive equipment or you have to send that out to be done, in which case there's nothing to do there. You just receive it back from the person who makes the profiles for you. But we'll see. Do you have any suggestions when printing with Image Print Black and using their profiles from my printer and chosen paper? That's a tough one. It's hard to say there because I don't know. I'm not familiar with the profiles that they're providing you. And so, again, it could be a little bit of a guessing game between the profiles and then Canson's papers. The reason why the profiles are so important is because the profiles, as I said, they will give your printer and Lightroom the right language to talk to the paper. They basically describe what the paper is capable of, what colors it can print, how much black it can hold. And so when you have that information in the profile, your prints are going to look better because it's a customized profile for the paper, a customized sort of instruction set, if you will. It helps the communication between the color management. When would you recommend Prestige? Well, again, don't go on what I showed you. I just had a sampling of different prints. I showed a lot of Platine, not as much Prestige. That's probably because I like the cotton backing on Prestige, and the surface I also really like for the kinds of work that I do. I tend to I'm doing landscape and nature. I'm not doing portraits where maybe you want the smoothest surface possible for someone's face. Platine works great for portraits as well, but I think the Baryta Photographique arguably might be even smoother. I like a little bit of that more surface dimension. I would use the Prestige when I wanted the most amount of perhaps the shininess, right? Prestige is going to give you the shiniest surface, something that you just really want to pop as much as possible in terms of the shininess, the color, etc. But it's something you have to try for yourself, experiment for yourself, and you'll get a feel for it as you explore the different papers. Can I view past presentations? I'm not sure, but if you go on the Canson website, maybe they'll have a posting on YouTube or something like that. I'm not 100% sure. Oh, and Jane is responding for me there. So there you go. Thanks, Jane. Can we download the graph you showed at the beginning? It explains the papers very simply. I could use that on my board for quick reference. Yes, I'm going to provide a PDF of that graph. Actually, you can get that graph on my website. So if you can come to my website and you can get the graph. You can get the graph and the charts there. All right, I think that pretty much does it for the questions. Thanks very much, everyone. Very important. I will suggest you can order or get a discovery pack of papers. That's the best way to learn. The sample packs give you different papers, and try them and see for yourself. Even if you print smaller versions of your images, you'll really get a feel for the papers and what they're capable of, and the ones that will complement the kind of work that you're doing. And that'll really give a nice, it'll give your prints a unique style and vision because you will be making this creative choice yourself. If you're interested in learning more about me, my website is creativepathworkshops.com, where I help photographers with their creative potential through visual storytelling. And we do have in-depth courses and sessions on printing with Canson paper. Drop by the site, and you can also sign up to get the charts that I showed before. All right, thanks very much, everyone. It's been great. There will be a recording of the video, I believe. So awesome. Thanks, everyone. See you next time. Take care.